My name is Paula Blake, and I am 63 years old. And the day my husband died, I learned exactly how little my children thought of us. It started like any other morning, if you can call it that, when your life ends in a living room. I walked in holding a mug of instant coffee, already thinking about which pills Thomas needed me to set out for him. And I saw him slumped over the side of his recliner, with his hand resting on his chest. At first I thought he'd fallen asleep, but when I called his name, he didn't move. I set my cup on the table so hard it splashed up the sides, and I went over and shook his shoulder, gently, then harder when I realized he was cold. I didn't panic, not right away, because in all our years together, Thomas was the one who kept calm when everything fell apart, and it was like part of that rubbed off on me. I called 911, explained what happened, and the dispatcher asked if I could try CPR, but I knew it was too late. I remember the way my voice sounded when I told her no, that he was already gone, like someone else was speaking from the back of my throat. The paramedics came and confirmed it, and I signed the paperwork with a pen that felt too small in my hand. When they left, the house felt emptier than I could have ever imagined, and I did the only thing I could think to do, which was call my children. I started with Allison, because she's the oldest, and always liked to act like the one who took charge, even when she didn't. The phone rang so many times I thought it would go to voicemail, but she finally picked up and sounded distracted, like she was doing something else while she waited for me to speak. I said, "Allison, it's Mom. I need you to listen carefully." She said, "Okay?" Like she was bracing for a grocery list. I swallowed, felt my throat ache, and said, "Your father passed away this morning. He died in his chair." There was this empty pause, and then she said, "Oh my God, Mom, that's awful." But her voice didn't have any weight to it. Before I could respond, she started rambling. "We literally just booked our vacation to Maui last night. The kids have been looking forward to this for months, and it's all non-refundable. Do you have any idea when the funeral might be? Because if it's next week, I don't know how we can be there." I felt like I was listening to a stranger, not my daughter. I said, "Your father is dead and you're worried about a vacation." She went quiet, then let out a little sigh and said, "Mom, I know you're upset, but you have to understand this is thousands of dollars and the kids will be heartbroken if we cancel." I didn't argue. I just said, "I'll let you know," and hung up before she could say another word. My hand was shaking when I set the phone down, but I knew I had to keep going. I called Brandon next. He answered after 2 rings. Sounded like he was typing or reading something while he spoke. I said, "Brandon, it's Mom. I need you to listen carefully." He said, "Yeah, what's going on?" I took a breath and told him, "Your father passed away this morning." Before we continue, have you ever been left alone to handle a loved one's funeral because family chose something else over showing up? If you've ever seen people reveal their true priorities when it mattered most, share it in the comments. Also, let me know where you're watching from. I read every comment, and if you're into stories like this, hit like and subscribe. It really helps. Thanks. Your father passed away this morning. He said, "Jesus," under his breath, then nothing for a while. I waited, hoping he'd say he was on his way, or ask if I was okay. But instead he said, "All right, well, listen, I've got back-to-back client meetings all next week, and this is really bad timing. When are you thinking for the service?" I felt something inside me sink so deep, I didn't know if it would ever come back up. I said, "I don't know yet, Brandon. I haven't even had time to think about that." He sighed, like I was being unreasonable, and said, "Okay, well, just let me know as soon as you set a date, so I can try to move some things around. No promises, though." He hung up before I could say anything else. I looked at the screen and realized he hadn't asked if I was all right. He hadn't even said he was sorry. My hands were numb when I called Courtney. She picked up on video, her face framed by the glow of her laptop, and when she saw my expression, she said, "Mom, what happened?" I didn't soften it. I just told her, "Your father died this morning. I found him in his chair." She covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that looked too quick, too practiced. She said, "Oh my God, Mom, I'm so sorry." But before I could answer, she started talking about her trip to Disney with her kids, how the reservations had been made 6 months ago, how everything was prepaid. She said, "Could we maybe have a small service now and a bigger memorial later when we get back?" I felt my lips pressed together so tight I thought I'd split the skin. I didn't reply right away because I knew if I opened my mouth, I'd scream. Finally, I said, "I'll let you know," and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, and realized there was no one coming to help me. No one who was going to show up to hold my hand and tell me it would be okay. Thomas and I had spent our lives sacrificing for these kids, helping them with down payments, co-signing loans, paying for camps and tuition, and in the end, none of it mattered enough for them to cancel a vacation. I stood up and walked to the counter where we kept the bills and the grocery lists, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and wrote one word across the top in block letters: Will. I underlined it 3 times. My hand stopped shaking the minute the ink touched the paper. I knew in that moment that if they couldn't show up for their father's funeral, they wouldn't get a penny of what he left behind. I felt something close to relief, like the decision was already made. My phone buzzed with a text from Allison. It read, "Hey Mom, just let us know what you decide about the funeral. We'll see what we can figure out. No apology, no offer to help, just logistics." I didn't reply. I set the phone face down and walked to the living room, picked up Thomas's wedding ring from the little dish he kept by his chair and held it so tight my knuckles hurt. I remembered how he used to say, "People show you who they are when it counts," and I knew he'd been right. They'd shown me exactly who they were. I didn't need to argue or explain. I just needed to make sure they felt the consequences of their choice. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up the phone, and called Russell. When he answered, I didn't bother with small talk. I said, "Russell, I need you to come by tomorrow morning. We're rewriting everything." He paused like he was waiting for me to soften, to say I was just upset and would change my mind. But I wasn't going to. My voice was steady when I told him, "I'm done pretending they care. If they won't honor their father in death, they won't profit from his life." He said he'd be here at 9. When I hung up, I sat back down, the legal pad in front of me, and started listing every account, every asset, every item in the house. I wrote out all of it in neat rows, and next to each line I wrote, "Pending revision." By the time I was done, it was past midnight, but I didn't feel tired. I felt like a woman who'd finally opened her eyes. The next morning I got up before the sun because I couldn't sleep anyway, and I spent almost an hour just sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, reading over the list I'd made on the legal pad, double-checking every account number, every note I'd scribbled in the margins about which child had borrowed what and when, almost like I needed to remind myself of all the times they'd needed us and we'd been there. Without hesitation. I don't know why it still surprised me that they couldn't give up a vacation for their father's funeral, but it did, and that feeling made my hands steady instead of shaking. When the clock hit 8:50, I saw Russell's car pull up out front. I didn't bother to tidy up the kitchen or pretend I was doing all right. I opened the door before he knocked, and he looked at me with that expression I'd seen on him at Thomas's retirement party. The one that said he didn't want to be the bearer of bad news, but he would be if he had to. I stepped aside so he could come in, and I motioned for him to sit at the table where I'd already laid out every folder I could find. Tax records, insurance papers, statements, even the old ledger where Thomas kept handwritten notes about household expenses. Russell sat down carefully and said, "Paula, before we start, I want to say again how sorry I am. Thomas was the best man I ever knew." I nodded because there was nothing to say that would make it better, and I didn't have the energy to pretend. I pushed the legal pad toward him and said, "I'm not going to dance around this. I want the will rewritten with conditions." He glanced down at the pad, then back up at me. "What conditions are you thinking?" he asked. His voice measured like he expected me to be emotional, but I wasn't. "I felt clearer than I had in years," I said. "If they don't attend their father's funeral in person, they inherit nothing. No proxies, no excuses, no rescheduled trips. If they show up, I still want the majority of the estate to go to Maria Ortiz." He raised an eyebrow, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. That the children would contest it, that it would look like I was manipulated in my grief, but I didn't care. I went on, Maria has been here every day since Thomas got sick. She sat with me the night he died. She brought food when I couldn't eat and stayed when everyone else disappeared. I will not leave everything to people who can't be bothered to show up." Russell set his pen down and leaned back in his chair. "Paula, you understand they will challenge this in court. They will claim you're acting out of grief and not thinking rationally." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "I've never thought more rationally in my life." He didn't argue after that. He pulled out his own legal pad and started making notes. We spent nearly 3 hours going through every detail, from the house title to the savings account to Thomas's pension. Every time he asked me if I was sure, I said yes. There was no hesitation in me anymore. He suggested we include a clause about the grandchildren, that perhaps I might want to set aside something small for their education, and after a long minute I agreed to that. It wasn't their fault their parents were selfish. I told him, set up a trust, enough to pay for college but nothing else. He nodded and kept writing. At one point, Maria came by to check on me, carrying a Tupperware container of chicken casserole. She saw Russell at the table and looked worried that she was interrupting, but I waved her in and thanked her. She set the food on the counter and quietly asked if I needed anything else, and I told her no, that she'd done more than enough. When she left, Russell looked at me over his glasses and said, "Does she know you plan to leave her the estate?" I shook my head. "I'm not telling her until it's done. She didn't ask for this, and I don't want her feeling uncomfortable." He tapped his pen against the pad, then said, "All right, let's be clear about this. You want the estate divided as follows: 30% in trust for the grandchildren's education, 70% to Maria if your children fail to attend the funeral. If they do attend, you want them to have equal shares minus Maria's portion?" I corrected him. "No, even if they attend, I want Maria to have the house and half the remaining funds. They can split what's left. Showing up out of obligation isn't the same as being here when it counts." He made a final note, then began drafting the language. Listening to him read it aloud felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life being sorted into legal terms. But at the same time, it felt right, like for once I was standing up for what mattered, instead of smoothing things over so no one got upset. When he finished, he slid the draft toward me and asked if I needed time to look it over alone. I told him no. I picked up my pen and signed every page without stopping. My hand didn't tremble once. He signed as witness, and then he carefully placed everything into a manila envelope and wrote the filing instructions across the front. He looked at me again, softer this time, and said, "You know this will burn the bridge with them." I met his eyes and said, "They lit the match when they chose a vacation over their father." After he left, I sat at the table a long time, staring at the envelope, thinking about the day each of my children had been born. I remembered the hours in labor, the first time I held them, the nights Thomas and I stayed up when they were sick, the birthday parties we scrimped to pay for, the ways we tried to be the kind of parents they could rely on. And I thought about how none of that mattered now that they were grown and had their own lives that didn't include us unless it was convenient. My phone buzzed with another text from Allison. "Hey, any updates on the service? We're trying to figure out if we can move the flights." I didn't bother replying. I turned the phone face down again. I stood up and went to the cabinet over the stove, where Thomas kept the important papers, pulled out the old tin box with our wedding photo tucked inside, and set it on the table next to the envelope. I looked at the photo for a long time, tracing the edge where the paper was worn. I whispered, "I kept my promise. They won't forget what matters," even though I knew he couldn't hear me. When Maria came by again that evening to drop off groceries, I thanked her and offered to pay for the extra trips she'd been making. She shook her head and said, "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Blake. I'm just glad you're not alone." I almost told her then what I'd done, but something stopped me. Maybe I needed to hold onto the secret a little longer, to let it settle. After she left, I poured a glass of water and sat back down at the table, the envelope beside me, and realized that for the first time since Thomas died, I didn't feel powerless. I felt like I was finally protecting what he cared about most: respect, loyalty, and the simple decency of showing up when it counts. Respect, loyalty, and the simple decency of showing up when it counts. The morning after I signed the new will, I woke up with this dull ache behind my eyes, like I'd been holding my breath all night. And the first thing I did was check my phone to see if any of them had sent anything that sounded remotely like an apology, or maybe even a real question about how I was coping. There was nothing except a single text from Brandon that read, "Mom, we need to pick a date so we can finalize our plans." And it was so casual, I felt my stomach turn. I didn't reply right away because I wanted to be sure I wasn't answering in anger. But after I made myself eat a piece of toast and drink some coffee, I realized I wasn't just angry. I was finished pretending this was normal. Around 10, I called the funeral home to set the service for June 15th. At 10 in the morning, the director, Mr. Willis, was soft-spoken and polite as he walked me through the arrangements, but I kept my tone brisk because I needed it to feel like a business transaction instead of another emotional spiral. After I hung up, I sat there for a moment, thinking about how Thomas would have handled this, and I knew he'd have been disappointed but not surprised. He always said our kids were good people in theory, but rarely in practice. And I hated that he'd been right. I picked up the phone again and called Allison first, since she seemed to think she was the one in charge. She answered on the second ring, sounding rushed, and before I could even say hello, she launched into a list of reasons why rescheduling would be best for everyone. I interrupted her and said, "The funeral is June 15th at 10 a.m. at Greenlawn Memorial. You and your siblings need to be there." She went quiet, and for a second I thought maybe she finally understood how serious this was. But then she sighed dramatically and said, "Mom, you're really going to do this while we're trying to get everything ready to leave? You know how hard it is to coordinate 4 kids and 2 jobs. This is just bad timing." My voice didn't even waver when I said, "I'm not interested in whether the timing is convenient for you. Your father deserves better than excuses." She started to protest, but I told her I needed to call her brother and hung up before she could keep talking. I called Brandon next, and when he picked up, I could hear other voices in the background, like he was in the middle of a meeting, but I didn't care. I said, "Brandon, the funeral is set, June 15th at 10. I expect you to be there." He cleared his throat and said, "Mom, I told you this week is impossible. I'm presenting to the board on Thursday, and flying cross-country for a funeral I don't have time to process isn't going to help anyone." I closed my eyes and counted to 3, because if I didn't, I was going to say something I couldn't take back. I said, "You will find a way. This isn't optional." He muttered something I couldn't quite catch, and when I asked him to repeat it, he said, "I said you're being manipulative." I felt my jaw clench so tight it hurt. If you think expecting you to come bury your father is manipulative, I don't know what to say to you. He said he'd see what he could do, which meant nothing, and I ended the call before he could say anything else. Finally, I called Courtney, who answered on video like she always did, her face already blotchy with tears she could summon faster than anyone I'd ever known. She said, "Mom, please can we find a way to do something that works for everyone? The kids are going to be devastated if we have to cancel Disney." I stared at her, wondering if she heard herself, if she realized she sounded like a teenager complaining about missing prom. I said, "I am not moving the funeral so you can go ride roller coasters. If you don't come, you don't come, but understand you will regret it." She started crying harder, and I waited, unmoved, because I'd already heard all the tears I could stand. "Please don't do this to us," she said. I almost laughed because it was clear she still thought this was about her. "You've made your priorities clear," I told her, and hung up. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone started buzzing with a group video call request from Allison. I considered ignoring it, but part of me wanted to look them all in the eye one more time. When I accepted, their faces popped up in little boxes. Allison tight-lipped and irritated, Brandon looking everywhere but at the camera, Courtney still wiping her eyes. Allison spoke first. "Mom, we need to talk about this like adults. We can't be expected to upend our lives with 3 days' notice." I said, "Your father died. That's the only notice you get." Brandon jumped in. "This isn't fair. You're acting like we don't care, but we're trying to be realistic about what we can do." I felt something in me snap. Realistic would have been showing up when your father needed you. Realistic would have been calling to see how I was instead of sending text messages about flight vouchers. Realistic would be admitting you don't want to come because it's inconvenient. Courtney sobbed. That's not true. We love you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Then act like it. None of them spoke for a moment. Finally, Allison said, "If you force this, you're going to ruin whatever relationship we have left." I looked at her face on the screen, the same face I'd kissed goodnight for 18 years. And I felt nothing. If this is what it takes to make you show up, maybe the relationship isn't worth saving, I said. Brandon closed his eyes like he was exhausted, and I thought about how Tomas used to say Brandon never could handle confrontation. "We'll see what we can do," he muttered, and ended the call. Courtney followed a second later, but Allison lingered, her mouth pressed in a tight line. "You're making a mistake," she said. "No," I told her. "I'm correcting one." When the screen went black, I sat at the table, feeling more tired than I could remember ever feeling, but also certain I'd done the right thing. Maria came by later to help me clean out the pantry because she knew I needed something to do with my hands. She didn't ask what was wrong, but when I told her the funeral plans, she nodded and said, "He deserves to be honored properly." I thought about how she had never once made me feel like a burden. She'd been here every day, making sure I ate, sitting with me in the evenings when the house was too quiet. She had been more present in my grief than any of my children. When she left, I sat at the kitchen table again, opened the calendar, and circled June 15th in red ink. I stared at that date until my eyes blurred and I whispered, "This is when it ends." I knew they'd come, eventually. Maybe because they felt guilty, or maybe because they were afraid of what not showing up would look like. But I also knew that no matter what excuses they tried to feed me, I'd already seen the truth. They'd shown me what mattered to them, and I wasn't going to forget it. The days between setting the funeral date and actually getting through it felt like they stretched forever, and every morning, I woke up with the same heavy feeling in my chest that never eased. No matter how many lists I made, or how many cabinets I cleaned out. I spent most of that week going over small details I thought would matter to Tomas, like making sure the program had his favorite hymn printed inside and that the florist used blue hydrangeas instead of white lilies because he always said lilies looked like something you sent to strangers, not to someone you loved. Maria came by every evening after her other clients and sat with me while I filled out paperwork and made calls, and even though she never said much, I knew she was the only person in my life at that moment who actually cared how I was managing instead of what the arrangements were going to cost them. The night before the funeral, I laid out my black dress and the necklace Thomas gave me on our 30th anniversary. And I sat in the living room holding the folded flag the VA sent me because I wanted to make sure my hands knew what it felt like to hold something that belonged to him one more time. That morning, I got up before dawn, showered, and made myself eat toast, even though I could hardly swallow. And by the time Maria arrived to help me carry everything to the car, I felt like I'd been awake for days. We didn't talk on the drive to the funeral home. I kept going over the same thought in my head, wondering if any of my children would show up on time or if they'd even come at all. Part of me hoped they wouldn't, so I wouldn't have to look them in the eyes and pretend to believe whatever excuses they'd rehearsed. When we pulled into the parking lot, I saw Allison's SUV parked near the entrance, and for a second, my stomach dropped, because even after everything, some small part of me still wanted to believe she would be the daughter I remembered, the one who used to sit with me in the kitchen and ask how my day was, the one who sent cards for no reason, just to say she loved me. But as soon as I walked inside and saw her standing near the sign-in table, her arms crossed tight over her chest, I knew nothing had changed. She looked at me like she was bracing for a fight, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. I nodded to her and went to the front, where Thomas's casket was arranged with the photos I'd picked, and I set the folded flag on top, just like he would have wanted. Brandon showed up 15 minutes later, checking his watch as he walked in, wearing a suit that still had the dry cleaner's tag tucked into the sleeve. He barely looked at me when he walked past, just nodded once like this was a business obligation he was squeezing in between meetings. Courtney came last, her husband trailing behind, carrying their youngest, and she immediately burst into loud sobs that drew everyone's attention. I didn't move to comfort her. I just stood there beside the casket, my hand resting on the polished wood, and waited for them to settle down. The service started exactly at 10. Mr. Willis read the obituary I'd written myself because I didn't trust anyone else to get it right. And while he spoke, I watched my children out of the corner of my eye. Allison kept glancing at her phone, like she was waiting for a message she'd rather be reading. Brandon looked bored, shifting in his seat and sighing every few minutes. Courtney cried into a tissue but didn't once look at the casket. I felt a strange calm settle over me then, because it was proof I'd done the right thing with the will. No one could accuse me of acting out of spite when they'd made it so obvious how little this day meant to them. When the service was over, people lined up to offer their condolences. Neighbors I hadn't seen in years, men who'd worked with Thomas at the plant, women from church who hugged me and told me stories about how he'd helped them fix their cars or carry groceries. Maria stood quietly near the back, and every so often she'd catch my eye and just give a little nod like she was reminding me I wasn't completely alone. After everyone had passed through, my children approached together, like they decided it was better to confront me as a group. Allison spoke first, her voice low. "Mom, I hope you understand how hard this has been for us to arrange. We had to cancel a lot of plans." I looked at her, not blinking, and said, "Your father died. That should have been all you needed to know." Brandon stepped forward, his hands in his pockets. "We're here now. That's what matters." I almost laughed, but instead I said, "We'll see." Courtney dabbed her eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom, I really am." I nodded because I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. They didn't stay long after that. Within 15 minutes, they were back in their cars, already halfway down the drive before I'd even finished gathering the leftover programs in the guest book. Maria came up beside me and offered to help carry things, and when I looked at her, I felt a tightness in my throat that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with gratitude. "Thank you," I told her, "for everything." She just squeezed my hand and said, "I'll follow you home." The ride back was quiet again, but instead of feeling empty, I felt certain. I kept thinking about how Thomas would have been proud that I hadn't let them steamroll me into changing the date or making excuses. When we got back to the house, Maria carried the boxes inside while I locked the door behind us, and then I walked into the living room and sat down in Thomas's chair. I stayed there a long time, my hands folded in my lap, until Maria came in and asked if I wanted her to stay for a while. I told her she could go home to her own family, that I just needed some time alone. When she left, I reached for the envelope Russell had given me with the finalized will and set it on the coffee table. I thought about the looks on my children's faces when they realized this day wasn't about them, that their absence in the weeks leading up to this moment had cost them more than they knew. I didn't feel smug. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt like someone who had finally stopped lying to herself about who her family really was. As the house settled into quiet again, I whispered to Thomas that I had done exactly what he'd asked me to do. I had made sure they couldn't pretend anymore. The morning of the will reading, I woke up feeling like every nerve in my body was humming with a quiet tension I couldn't shake. And even though I'd been going over this moment in my head for weeks, part of me still wondered if I had the strength to see it through without wavering. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen while the pot sputtered, thinking about all the times Thomas and I had talked about what we'd leave behind for the kids, how he always believed they'd appreciate what we'd built and understand the value of respect, how he thought the money and the house would be reminders of everything we'd sacrificed so they could have easier lives. I knew now he'd been wrong about them. And I also knew if he were standing beside me, he would have understood why I did this. By 9:30, Maria was at my door to help me set up the chairs in the living room because Russell had suggested we do it here instead of in his office so I'd feel more comfortable. I appreciated that more than I could say, and I told Maria she didn't have to stay, but she shook her head and said she'd sit in the back because she wanted to be there for me. I didn't argue. Part of me needed her calm presence in that room. At 10 sharp, Russell arrived, carrying his leather briefcase and a smaller envelope I recognized from when he'd shown me the final draft. He greeted me quietly, set his things down on the dining table, and asked if I was ready. I told him I was as ready as I was ever going to be. We didn't have to wait long for the others. Allison came first, dressed in a crisp navy blouse and black slacks like she was showing up to a corporate meeting, her mouth pinched in a tight line that told me she was already rehearsing whatever speech she planned to give, about how they'd all done their best. Brandon showed up minutes later, carrying a tablet under his arm and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He didn't even bother to look around the house as he came in, just nodded at me and asked if there was Wi-Fi in case he needed to check in with his office. I told him no, and the way his face fell almost made me laugh. Courtney was last, walking in with her husband trailing behind her, carrying a reusable grocery bag full of toys to keep their youngest occupied, which struck me as absurd considering they were here to find out what their father had left behind. They all settled into the chairs Maria and I had arranged in a semicircle, and I sat across from them, close enough that I could see every flicker of expression on their faces. Russell cleared his throat and opened the briefcase, pulling out a thick sheaf of papers clipped neatly together. The room went quiet in a way that made me feel like the walls themselves were holding their breath. He began by reading a short statement about Thomas, how much he had valued his family, and how he wanted his wishes respected without dispute. I watched my children closely as he spoke, and I saw their expressions shift. Allison trying to look solemn, Brandon glancing at the stack of papers like he was already calculating, Courtney dabbing her eyes with a tissue she hadn't even bothered to dampen. When Russell moved on to the details, he started with the formal declarations. Debt settled, funeral expenses covered. And then he paused, just long enough that I knew he was giving them one last chance to reflect. No one said a word. He continued, his voice steady as he explained the conditional nature of the inheritance. It was Thomas's and Paula's wish, he said, that each of their children be present for the funeral service, as a demonstration of respect and commitment to this family. Attendance in person was required. I saw Allison stiffen, her jaw tightening, and Brandon shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking to Courtney. I knew they all remembered how close they'd come to not showing up, how each of them had tried to negotiate or postpone or excuse themselves. Russell went on. Because each of you did attend, the following provisions remain in effect, with specific allocations. He read the next section slowly, clearly, so no one could claim they hadn't understood. Allison, Brandon, and Courtney would each receive 20% of the liquid assets, checking, savings, retirement accounts, distributed equally after all final expenses were settled. There was a moment where I could see the relief start to bloom across Allison's face, like she thought they were in the clear, and I let her sit in that hope for a few seconds. Then Russell set down the main packet and picked up the smaller envelope, holding it carefully as if it might catch fire. In addition to the base allocations, he said, there is a supplemental bequest designated for the individual whom Paula has named as her primary caregiver and companion during her time of bereavement. He looked up at me for confirmation, and I nodded once. His gaze moved slowly across the room, and for the first time since they'd walked in, none of my children could hold eye contact with me. Maria Ortiz, he said evenly, has been named as the beneficiary of the remainder of the estate, including the house, the vehicle, and all personal property not otherwise specified. The silence that followed felt almost physical. I watched their faces cycle through disbelief, confusion, and the slow creep of outrage. Courtney was the first to speak, her voice rising in a shrill whisper. "You're giving her everything?" I didn't answer because I knew Russell would explain it better than I ever could. He continued. It was Paula's explicit instruction that Maria received this portion in recognition of her consistent presence, compassion, and assistance during the final weeks of Thomas's life and the period that followed. This decision is final. Brandon's face had gone a shade paler, and he looked at me with something close to fury. "You can't be serious," he said. "You're leaving the house to someone who doesn't even share your blood?" I looked back at him, my voice steady. "I'm leaving it to the person who was here when it mattered." Allison's eyes were wet now, but her expression was hard. "We were here," she said, her voice low and shaky. "We came." I didn't look away. "You came because you were afraid of how it would look if you didn't. You came because you thought you'd lose something." I could see the way that truth landed, heavy and undeniable. Maria sat in the back corner, her hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide, and I knew she hadn't expected any of this. She started to say something, but Russell held up a hand gently and told her there would be time for questions later. Brandon stood up so fast his chair tipped over, and he didn't bother to pick it up. "This is insane," he snapped. "You're punishing us because we have lives, because we can't drop everything at a moment's notice." I felt a surge of tired disappointment that I knew would never leave me. "No," I said calmly. "I'm holding you accountable for how you chose to treat your father's death and my grief." Courtney was crying in earnest now, tears streaking down her face. "Please, Mom, we can fix this," she whispered. "Just don't do this." I thought about all the times I'd believed their apologies and promises to do better. All the times I'd told myself they'd grow out of this selfishness. I couldn't pretend anymore. "It's already done," I said. Russell gathered the papers, sliding them into the folder with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. "Copies of the documents will be sent to each of you," he said evenly. "Any attempt to contest will be met with the legal defense already established in these provisions." No one moved or spoke for a long moment. Then, Allison finally looked at me, her voice hoarse. "I hope you know you're destroying this family." I met her eyes without flinching. "No," I said quietly. "You destroyed it when you decided a vacation mattered more than your father." I could see then that nothing I said would ever make them understand, and I realized I didn't need them to. As they filed out one by one, none of them looked back. Maria came up to me, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Blake, I don't know what to say." I reached for her hand. "You don't have to say anything," I told her. "You were here. That's all that matters." As the door closed behind the last of them, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time since Thomas died, I knew I had done exactly what needed to be done. After the will reading, the house felt different. Not just empty the way it had since Thomas died, but clear. Like I'd finally stripped away every lie I'd been telling myself about who my children were and what we meant to them. I sat alone in the living room for almost an hour after Russell and Maria left, staring at the spot where Allison had been sitting, remembering the way her face twisted when she realized she wasn't getting what she thought she was owed. I thought about Brandon's anger and Courtney's tears, and I wondered if any of them would call me that night to say anything that sounded like real remorse. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't. I was right. By evening, the only message on my phone was a single text from Courtney that said, "I hope you're happy." And when I read it, I felt a calm I hadn't expected. I set the phone aside and made myself a simple dinner, because I knew Tomas would have told me to keep eating and to take care of myself. I didn't feel like I was punishing them anymore. I felt like I was finally respecting myself. The next morning, Maria came by to check in, and when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table with my cup of coffee, she hesitated by the doorway, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to come in now that everything was official. I told her to sit down, and she lowered herself into the chair opposite me, her hands folded tight in her lap. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "I don't know if I can accept this. It feels like too much." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "Maria, you earned it. You were here when I needed someone. You were here when no one else cared." She shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "I was just doing my job." I squeezed her hand. "No, you were being a friend." She started crying in earnest then, and I felt something break open in me. But it wasn't pain. It was relief, because for the first time I knew I hadn't made a mistake in trusting someone. I knew she wasn't going to disappear now that the paperwork was signed. After she calmed down, I told her that nothing had to change right away, that she didn't have to move in or take anything she didn't want. She could decide what made sense for her, and I would respect it. She nodded and said she would think about it, and before she left, she hugged me so tight I felt my chest ache. But in a good way. That afternoon, I sat down and started writing letters to each of my children, because even if they never forgave me, I needed them to hear why I did what I did. I told them the truth without sugarcoating it. I wrote to Allison that I had spent years pretending her polite distance was maturity, when it was really just detachment. I wrote to Brandon that his success had never mattered to me as much as his presence, that I would have traded every promotion and every big deal if it meant he would have shown up when I needed him. I wrote to Courtney that her tears didn't mean as much as she thought they did, not when her actions always proved she cared more about appearances than substance. I told all three of them that I loved them, but I couldn't keep rewarding their neglect with my silence. I sealed the letters and left them on the counter because I didn't trust myself to mail them yet. Maybe I would in a few weeks. Maybe never. I had spent so many years worrying about whether they approved of me, whether they thought I was a good mother, and in the end, none of that changed who they were when it counted. I knew Thomas would have supported me. He always said loyalty wasn't something you could teach to grown adults. Either they learned it young or they never learned it at all. In the days that followed, I expected someone to show up at my door, to scream at me, or to try to guilt me into reversing everything. No one did. Allison sent a short email to ask if there was any chance I'd reconsider and offered to have a civil conversation, which I ignored. Brandon sent nothing. Courtney sent another long text about how hurt she was and how she hoped someday I'd see how unfair I'd been. But it read like something she'd written to make herself feel better, not to actually reach me. I didn't respond to any of it. Maria continued to visit daily, sometimes just for a few minutes to check on me, sometimes to bring groceries or sit with me in the evenings so the house wouldn't feel so silent. One afternoon, she offered to help me sort through Thomas's clothes, and I realized it was the first time since he died that the idea didn't make me feel like I was suffocating. We worked together for hours, deciding which things to donate, which to keep. She never pushed me to move faster than I could. And when I had to stop to catch my breath, she sat quietly until I was ready to start again. When we finished, I felt lighter, like I'd closed a door without slamming it. A week after the will reading, I asked Maria to drive with me to the cemetery. We didn't talk much on the way there. When we got out of the car, I carried a small bouquet of flowers and the folded flag, and we walked to Thomas's grave together. I knelt and laid everything down, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. I told him I'd kept my promise, that I'd made sure our legacy wasn't something they could just collect and forget about. Maria stood behind me, her hand on my shoulder, and I knew I wasn't alone. Before we left, I looked at the headstone one last time and whispered, "We did it." Driving home, I didn't feel regret. I felt sure. I knew the story the kids would tell about me now, that I was cold, that I'd let a stranger take everything that was supposed to be theirs. But I also knew the truth. I had chosen loyalty over obligation, honesty over appearances. I had chosen to honor the man I married, instead of the children who only remembered him when it was convenient. And as I pulled into the driveway with Maria beside me, I finally understood that sometimes doing the right thing looks like betrayal to people who never showed up in the first place.